Hello. So I've finished about 3 to 4 books, almost 5. I'm reading The Confessions by St. Augustine, and I'm almost done that. Fun book, by the way. And I feel like it's actually changed my life a little bit. But um, I've read 3 or 4 books, and these are the 3 or 4 books that I've read. There's going to be some glare. No, there's not. Very nice. These 3, or no, these 4. So the first one is by Siri Plokia. I actually just got his book on like the Ukraine-Russo conflict. It's The Gates of Europe. It's a modern history of Ukraine. This was actually it's not the best book, I think, on Ukrainian history, but it does what I wanted it to do, which is just to get a little bit of background information on the origins of modern Ukraine, its relations with Russia, with Poland, and to kind of have like some stepping stones and where to go for further sources. The author writes pretty clearly inside the book, and that's a pro, but the downside is that it reads like basically if somebody gathered a like historiography of, let's say, like 200 sources or whatever, and then proceeded to explain them in the most straightforward fashion, one by one. It kind of reads like that, almost like an AI could have written this book. I don't think an AI did write this book, but other than that, I mean, I did learn some things. I didn't realize how much conflict there was between the Ukrainians and the Poles. I knew there was some conflict. The origins of Ukrainian nationalism is not as straightforward as I once thought. I used to think that like it was mostly the Cossacks, but there was 2 separate Ukrainian nationalist movements that had different ideas. One wanted to go with Poland, one wanted to go with Russia. I didn't realize how fractured it was in the beginning. It also really highlights the continuity of conflict that has gone on in Ukraine, which makes me think more that the conflict inside Ukraine is to do with geopolitics, like geographical nature of politics, as opposed to intellectual disagreements. Yeah, overall, it's a pretty good book, and I would recommend reading it if you want like a brief overview or like an introduction to Ukrainian history. This next book is The Fear of Freedom or The Fear from Freedom, depending on which country you're in. It has 2 titles. It's by Eric Fromm. I won't go too much into this because I made a review on my channel, but I will say that it was a decent book. Like I would be willing to give it a 7 out of 10. Not anything too high, maybe around there, like ballparking it around 7. The book gets a little bit repetitive in some chapters. The ideas aren't necessarily groundbreaking. Like you can find a lot of these ideas in other works, especially if you've read some of the other authors from this school of thought. What is it called? Is it the Frankfurt School of Thought, I think? Where like I think Ernest Becker is in it as well. But surprisingly, this book has a lot of socialist lenses. Like I would say like he's legally speaking, like right-leaning, but socially speaking, left-leaning. That kind of caught me off guard about this book. Yeah, it's an interesting book, and I got a few ideas about the nature of freedom and the psychological problem of freedom, as he calls it. But if you're not looking to like necessarily read about freedom or read an Eric Fromm book, I probably wouldn't recommend this book. Now, this book, The Rise of Mutual Funds and Insider's View, was not quite what I was expecting, but also not that bad. So this book is actually written by basically a chairman of a board that helps promote policies that can improve regulations around mutual funds. That's what he's not quite a lawyer. I believe he's like trained in finance. So he's not quite a lawyer, but he does understand the mechanics of policies and how they how they shape mutual fund markets, which I wasn't necessarily looking for that. But I feel like I'm more educated about the nature of mutual funds as a result of this. I do think in terms of like having financial history literacy, it's a useful book to read because it talks about how certain acts and institutions shaped the mutual fund industry. Like the Investment Act and so on and so forth. Also talks about the advantages of mutual funds that are not necessarily obvious. Besides, like you can look at like metrics and see the returns of mutual funds versus private hedge funds, whatever. But there are legal reasons as to why there are advantages to mutual funds. There's more transparency with them, so on and so forth. They're regulated a little bit more closely. I was also shocked to see how anti-mutual fund banks were, especially money market funds. because I think banks and insurance companies, because banks and insurance companies both had financial instruments that were like services that they were offering that money markets were also then competing with. And money markets soaked up a lot of that market and took it away from them. So that was shocking to hear, to see how, whenever I think of modern day mutual funds that involve money markets, I think of banks. But yeah, if you're interested in mutual funds and you want to know like the history of mutual funds, definitely pick this book up. There's not too many books that are good on mutual funds. Like John C. Bogle's book on mutual fund is okay if you know nothing about mutual funds. But other than that, like you're only going to get really, really dense technical books. And yeah, I was just looking for something to read like alongside a finance textbook, which this was. So I can recommend it. I would probably say it's like a 7 out of 10 though. Now this last book is the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Death. And I actually had finished like 75% of this book a long time ago. And recently I finished the last couple of chapters. This is a pretty fun book. It goes into all the topics you would think that are worthwhile discussing on the nature of death. So for example, like personal identity and the survival of death. What happens to your personal identity after death? Can personal identity be embedded into like objects, or does it die when you die? It's an interesting question. It goes into the abortion debate. Abortion debate. It goes into that a little bit. Yeah, even the different philosophers that are involved with death, different philosophies of death. It's a pretty systematic book on all the topics that you would want to discuss on the nature of death. Yeah, I think that's also like when someone clinically dead. That's another interesting question, especially in the medical sciences. If you're looking for a book on death, there's this one, and then there's another Oxford handbook on this topic called the Oxford Handbook of Death and Ritual, I think. It's about basically like all the rituals we have around death and how we conceive of death in modern culture and where that originates from. That book I want to read as well. But yeah, this is probably one of my favorite books on death. I remember I was looking for a lot of books on death and I couldn't find too many that were good. And this hit the spot. This is exactly what I wanted. Like a broad scope, very encompassing, very exhaustive. Like this is probably 200, 300,000 words long. Exploration of the nature of death. I would say this is probably like an 8 out of 10. And if you want a book on death, I can highly recommend this. So those are all the books that I read in like the past month or two. I'm currently reading like some Afghan history books. I want to read 3 of those. And I'm also reading some books on like freedom. I have the Oxford Handbook of Freedom. And I'm reading Christian mysticism. You've probably seen my previous library tours. So I have some of those books I'm reading, like the Confessions I'm currently reading, which is quite fun. I'll talk about that in then another like reading update video. With that being said, if there's any books you want me to buy, especially like esoteric books, I've said this a couple of times. Somebody mentioned this book called The Anatomy of Depression that I bought the second the person mentioned it, because it was a really esoteric book. It's very thick and long and on a specific topic. If you have any books like that you recommend me, let me know, and I will check them out. But with that being said, bye-bye.